In January of 1942, the Desert War seemed to have turned against Erwin Rommel, but only for a moment. Operation Crusader had relieved Tobruk, pushed Axis forces back across Cyrenaica, and carried the British Eighth Army westward over hundreds of miles of harsh Libyan desert. On paper, it looked like a victory that might finally remove the Axis threat from eastern Libya and give the British breathing room before the next phase of the war. Yet the desert punished victory almost as harshly as defeat, and Rommel's return to the offensive showed that in North Africa, ground gained too quickly could become ground that could not be held. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. The Western Desert was not a normal battlefield with clear front lines and secure rear areas. It was a vast theater of distance, dust, heat, rock, sand, tracks, supply dumps, and isolated ports. Armored columns could move with startling speed, but only as long as fuel, water, ammunition, spare parts, and recovery vehicles kept pace behind them. A tank that outran its fuel trucks was not a weapon anymore. It was a stranded machine in an empty landscape. That simple truth shaped the whole campaign, and it explains why Operation Crusader's success did not settle the war in the desert. The British victory in Crusader had been real, but it had also been costly and untidy. The Eighth Army had relieved Tobruk and forced Rommel to withdraw, but British armored formations had suffered heavily, and the advance westward stretched the Army's communications and supply arrangements thin. The farther the British moved from Egypt, the longer their transport routes became, and every mile added strain to the trucks and workshops that made armored warfare possible. Meanwhile, Rommel shortened his own line by falling back toward El Gazala, where Axis forces could rest, refit, and receive supplies that were beginning to move more freely into Libya. Rommel understood the desert as a place where the psychological effect of movement could be almost as important as the movement itself. He had been forced backward, but he had not been destroyed, and that distinction mattered. His opponents often struggled to decide whether he was beaten, retreating, regrouping, or preparing to strike again. In January, British commanders believed Axis strength was too reduced for a serious counteroffensive, and they were preparing for their own future operations, rather than expecting an immediate blow. Rommel saw weakness in that assumption, and turned what began as reconnaissance into something much more dangerous. On the 21st of January, Rommel sent armored columns forward from the El Gazala area, testing the British screen in front of him. What he found was not a firm defensive wall, but a thin and uncertain covering force. In the desert, such discoveries could change a commander's intention very quickly, because an armored reconnaissance that met little resistance could become an attack before the enemy fully understood what was happening. Rommel pushed harder, and the British forward position began to give way. What had looked like a cautious probing movement became a return to maneuver warfare at the worst possible moment for the Eighth Army. The speed of the Axis advance created confusion out of proportion to its initial size. British units that expected time to prepare suddenly had to move, retreat, cover gaps, and protect supply areas. Benghazi, the important port on the Cyrenaican coast, fell back into Axis hands near the end of January, reversing one of the major gains of the previous campaign. That mattered for more than prestige, because ports were the lungs of the Desert War. If an army could use a forward port, it shortened the road haul for everything from petrol to artillery shells. If it lost that port, the burden shifted back onto trucks already worn by distance. This was not simply Rommel performing one more dramatic dash across the desert. It was a demonstration of how fragile operational success could be when logistics, command expectations, and battlefield tempo fell out of alignment. The British had won ground in Operation Crusader, but they had not built a stable system behind it quickly enough to make the victory secure. Their forward troops were not positioned to absorb a sharp counterstroke, and their leadership still had to solve the deeper problem of how to fight a fast, armored enemy across open desert. Rommel exploited those weaknesses with the instinct of a commander who understood that speed could become a weapon. Yet Rommel's success also had limits, and those limits are just as important as the advance itself. His army could not drive forever simply because it had regained momentum. Axis formations still depended on long sea routes across the Mediterranean, vulnerable ports, truck columns, repair units, and fuel deliveries that were never as secure as Rommel wanted. Tanks could win time and space, but trucks decided whether that time and space could be used. By early February, the Axis pursuit had carried the British back toward a defensive line running from the coast near Gazala down toward Bir Hakeim, west of Tobruk, and there the front began to stabilize again. The retreat to Gazala created the shape of the next campaign. The British did not fall all the way back into Egypt, and Tobruk did not immediately return to siege conditions. But the mood had changed. Operation Crusader's promise had faded into the realization that Rommel remained a dangerous opponent who could recover faster than expected. The Eighth Army now had to create a defensive system strong enough to stop another Axis advance, while also preserving the mobile armored reserves needed to fight in the open desert. That tension between fixed positions and mobile response would become the central problem of Gazala. The January counteroffensive also exposed a recurring British difficulty in the desert. Winning a battle did not automatically mean mastering the method of desert war. British forces had courage, material strength, and growing experience, but their command system still struggled with coordination between infantry boxes, armored brigades, artillery, air support, and distant headquarters. Armored warfare in North Africa demanded more than good tanks and brave crews. It required timely reconnaissance, reliable wireless communication, a shared understanding of the commander's intent, and the ability to concentrate force before the enemy shifted away. When those pieces did not connect, even a numerically strong army could appear strangely off balance. For Rommel, the advance back toward Gazala restored his reputation after the retreat from Crusader, but it also encouraged a dangerous pattern. He had seen again that bold movement could dislocate the British and produce results that seemed impossible to more cautious commanders. That lesson would shape his conduct in the coming months, especially when he prepared to attack the Gazala line in late May. But there was a risk hidden inside the success. The more Rommel trusted audacity, the more his army depended on improvisation. And improvisation in the desert could not replace fuel, engineering work, ammunition supply, and orderly maintenance forever. For the British, Rommel's return was a warning that the desert battlefield did not reward optimism. A force that had advanced too far, too fast, and without enough depth could be hit before it had settled into its new position. A line on a map meant little unless it was supported by reserves, transport, air cover, minefields, artillery, and clear command arrangements. Gazala would be built in response to that lesson, with fortified boxes, minefields, and armored formations intended to strike back when Rommel moved. But the very need for such a system showed how much uncertainty remained after Crusader. Rommel's January counterattack matters because it sets the entire season in motion. It turned a British victory into a temporary phase, restored Axis control over much of Cyrenaica, and forced the Eighth Army back toward the defensive framework that would soon become the Gazala line. More broadly, it reveals one of the enduring truths of armored warfare. Success is not just the moment when tanks move forward, but the ability to sustain, coordinate, and consolidate that movement before the enemy reacts. In the desert, momentum could appear suddenly and vanish just as quickly. Rommel had come back, and the campaign was no longer about what Crusader had achieved, but about whether the British could stop the next blow before it opened the road to Tobruk and Egypt.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.